Hello everyone and welcome to the Activist Lawyer podcast. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm your host to this podcast, which offers a platform for lawyers to share their story and their journey into law and activism. Our guests will discuss the challenges and highlights of their work, as well as important cases, opinions on legal and political matters, and will offer up advice and tips for anyone interested in pursuing a career in human rights law, public interest law, or criminal justice. The Activist Lawyer podcast is brought to you by the Granite Podcast Studio. Thank you so much for listening. So today I am delighted to be joined by Nusrat Uddin, who is partner and head of public law and human rights at Wilsons Solicitors. Nusrat specialises in public law and human rights with a particular focus on modern slavery, forced labour and human trafficking. She brings cases against central and local government bodies for failing their duties, as well as claims against those who have exploited their workers. In 2023, she was awarded Public Law Lawyer of the Year in the Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year Awards. Nusrat also specialises in business and human rights work. She has provided evidence for several US investigations into complaints against companies from the fashion industry through to rubber gloves. Nusrat's team have pioneered the first case against the UK authorities in relation to forced labour in their own supply chains, which settled with the government conceding and agreeing to improve their due diligence. We talk a lot about some of those cases and a little bit more on top, and it's truly fascinating work. I really enjoyed speaking with Nusrat, and she's been really generous in terms of her sharing her advice and her experience and her journey into law, which is truly fascinating. So I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast as much as I did speaking with Nusrat about her legal journey. Thank you. So Nusrat, thank you so much for joining me today on the Activist Lawyer podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. Well, let's start a little bit back in time about your journey into law and what maybe motivated you to pursue law as a career, and how did your focus on public law and human rights come into play?
Yeah, I mean, we are talking a while ago, 10 years qualified now. So I initially graduated with a degree in psychology, kind of was always interested in people. And I guess that's why I did psychology and trying to resolve their issues. Loved studying psychology, but found by the end of the degree, I kind of I wanted to find a career where I could really fix the problems. And I found with psychology, it was always trying to make the situation a bit better, or using kind of drug interventions. And I wanted somewhere where I actually changed something, and it was law that I went back to in terms of, I actually initially was working on a grad scheme. After I graduated, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was working for my sins in the corporate world and absolutely hated it. And then the recession hit in 2008, and I was like, this is not where I want to be right now. It wasn't a pleasant place to be. So I went and saw a career coach, which was something very random to do in your mid-20s when you didn't know what to do. And I remember it was like a group coaching program, and I went on the first session, and they said to you, what did you want to do when you were younger, or what were you passionate about when you were younger? And I kind of remembered being at school and being part of Amnesty International group, and always kind of going on anti-war protests, but always thinking, oh, those human rights lawyers, they're incredible, but never really identifying myself as that, and really never really seeing anyone that looked like me or, was like me as a human rights lawyer, and never really put myself in that position. But I think having worked in the corporate world a little bit and realizing actually there's lots of people out there doing jobs, that, you wouldn't even, I think I realized that there's a lot of very well-paid bankers out there who are doing jobs that aren't really very, what can I say? They're not really very worthwhile. It didn't really feel like a worthwhile thing. And I thought actually, having worked in there, I thought, well, I'm doing this as well. I'm able to do this just like they are. And it gave me really the confidence to think back and be like, well, why not? Why can't I do law? I hated banking, and I just thought, it's got to be better than this. I was very naive, I think, about it. So yeah, I went back to study. I did my GDL, sorry. I don't know if it's still called that anymore. It's the law conversion course. And then I was lucky, very lucky, to get my first paralegal job at Bat Murphy. So this was about a year after I had left the corporate world, and then did my LPC part-time while I was at Bat Murphy the first year, and then Hickman Rose the second year, and then went into my training contract at Fisher Meredith, and then qualified 2014. Yeah.
Brilliant. Wow. So a complete change.
And I joined Wilsons and I haven't looked back. So I've been really lucky.
Yeah.
Really lucky. I know there's a lot of people out there who, it's so tricky getting your kind of first break in the law, and it's getting harder. So I'm very grateful, to those initial organisations that kind of saw me, and I had no legal experience. I had all this corporate stuff, and I think actually that's some advice I'd give to kind of aspiring lawyers. Is I was doing a lot of voluntary work, and I didn't even realise that my voluntary work was something that I would be putting on my CV later. And I think it's because I was just following my passion. So even I was doing this job in the banking sector, which I absolutely hated. I was volunteering and helping underprivileged kids at the weekend. Yeah. I was also part of an organisation that was doing kind of community cohesion between the police and the local communities, and all of that kind of came back to my own kind of background and, my own interface with the police and human rights and the kind of anti-terrorism laws that came in post 9/11 and the impact that had on the Muslim community as well, and very much feeling kind of the impact of that, being Muslim, growing up in a very non-diverse area, and really feeling the impact of 9/11 personally for me and my family, and that playing out then in government policies and discrimination that I saw a lot in the cases at Bat Murphy when I started working. It was really interesting actually to see that kind of full circle from experiences in my youth, and then kind of volunteering at organisations trying to interface between the community and the police, and then actually working in actions against the police where they've really breached their powers in how they were carrying out with the terrorism laws.
So it really was a full circle moment, as you say. And it's interesting how you say that, even voluntary work as well. And I always emphasize this with younger people or people who are considering changing a career into law. It really does stand by you. And I've noticed that too. It really does. Even now when we're interviewing people, we're looking at their commitment, how they're showing their commitment to this area, because it's a really hard job, and you want to see that somebody understands that and has experienced that and the difficulties of working in this sector. Because I think you see a lot of kind of budding solicitors and budding lawyers who are, who really want to do good work, but they're really green. And actually when they come into the world of, it's legal aid who are really against you, it's the government lawyers who you're up against, it's the courts who have a lot of sympathy for the government and their lawyers. So it's all of those factors that can really wear you down, because it's you representing your client, and then your client as well, who can be really vulnerable and you're trying to build up this trust with. It really does feel like all the walls are up against you, and you have to kind of break them all down one by one. And it can be relentless, and it can be really, it takes a long time to actually make progress and get to the point where you can get to courts and you can get a judgment and you can actually feel like you're making a difference for even one client. So I think even myself, I was extremely naive, and I was like, I just want to make the world better and I just want to help people, and this seems really worthy. But I think the reality of it, when you actually start doing this work, is it's not glamorous. It's really not glamorous. It can sound really glamorous. But most of the cases won't be on the news. Most of the cases
nobody will know about but you work quite independently as well. So you've really got to have that kind of internal motivation to keep going. And you see it, and you also do see it. You see some incredible candidates coming forward who have, really great experience. But it's also a terribly underfunded area, right? Yeah, so there's not many jobs. No. It's very competitive. So yeah, I really feel for the next generation coming through.
Yeah. Gosh, it is. It really is tough and challenging work. But before we get into some of your cases, and you really have made a difference, and I've been reading through a lot of them and was fascinated by the outcome. So we'll get into those. But first, just in general, what does a day in your life look like at work? What type of cases are coming your way? What does because you're head of, obviously, of your the public law and human rights. Yeah. So you obviously have a team working on these various issues that are coming through. What does it look like?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, obviously, as the head of department, you're not only working on client cases, you're also trying to manage the team, like you said, and think longer term about how, the direction of the team and the direction of the firm as well. But yeah, it differs really. It differs in time of the year, different with what's going on with recruitment at the moment, where we've just finished a round of recruitment actually, and it feels like a really exciting time. There's a lot of new people who are going to be joining, and there's a lot of, I think what I love about our public law and human rights department is there's such a wide variety of cases that we do. I mentioned a little bit about how I started working in police actions, and then when I was in training, I was doing community care, and I was doing immigration detention work and more immigration as well. So what I really loved about Wilsons Public Law Department is that we do all of that. We do the whole range of, from being detained, getting them out of detention, to the unlawful detention civil claim, to, if they were picked up and they weren't identified as a victim of trafficking by the police, then an action against the police. If they're a child and they need to be age assessed and supported by the local authority, then we'd do the community care file. And I love the fact that we're able to do all of that. I'm able to do all of that. Our team are able to do all of that and have that really kind of full round service for the clients. So I guess that's what I mean in terms of the day could look like anything. Yeah, it could be, an urgent, JR for a detention client, or it could be, an action against the police coming in. But what I'm really loving is, from that management perspective, is having, like you said, worked on some big cases, is actually nurturing the next generation. Yeah. So it's not only the cases that are coming in for me, it's kind of, I'm really excited about seeing the new energies that are coming in and people's new interests. There's a lot in terms of AI that's going on, and I, being the dinosaur that I am, I'm just like,
yes,
no idea, but it's a really interesting area in terms of how powers are being, misused with technology. And we've got some, individuals who are really interested in that, and, are even teaching me about that. So, so a bit of a mix really in terms of cases, managing, but also learning, always learning. So, it's an exciting time, like I said, yeah.
Wonderful. And just in terms of giving examples of your work, I had a look through one of your cases, which is that of Wong versus Basfar. And I find it so interesting. So you might take us through that a little bit, and how that case came about and the outcome, which was really groundbreaking.
It was, and I really should mention that I was totally standing on the shoulders of giants there, because that case was really the fruition of decades of work, really, I would say, from other organisations and other cases that had chipped away at the law in this area. So it's really interesting, actually, because I mentioned that I worked in banking initially, and I did a psychology degree. So the role that I was working in banking was using my psychology degree in occupational psychology. So it was kind of related to HR. So it was employment law. And I remember when I went back to study at the College of Law, there was a talk by Jamila at ATLU, so the Anti-Trafficking Labour Exploitation Unit. And she came in and she was talking about how she had innovatively used employment law as a way to bring to justice traffickers. So using the employment tribunal to argue for victims of trafficking to get wages and to get all of their employment rights that they've always obviously had infringed. And I just found it incredible to bring this employment law stuff that I'd kind of done in my past career and the ability to help trafficking victims. And I think that's really the seed. Yeah. She didn't know me, and now we've worked so collaboratively on this case and many others. And that was, over a decade ago. So ATLU really were at the forefront of this kind of work, starting in the employment tribunals, bringing these cases. And then there were 2 previous cases, one which had overturned state immunity in relation to trafficking, and the other was very similar to Wong and Basfar. But what happened is by the time the hearing in the Supreme Court was happening in that case, the diplomat had actually been sent back to the country of origin and was no longer a diplomat. So the judgment was made about former diplomats, not current diplomats. So that case quashed diplomatic immunity, but for former diplomats. So really, when this case came about, it was, like I said, it was taking forth those 2 cases and getting to the point where actually we are looking at what happens to a current diplomat who is still in office. And it was a very, again, like I was saying before, it was a very long process, not only in those previous cases, but actually in terms of the client. I mean, I think I saw the client first in probably 2018 or 19. And if you think about, we didn't get judgment until 2023. So we're looking at a 4 or 5 year process of starting in the employment tribunal. That's when the diplomat challenged the fact that he had diplomatic immunity. We had an initial hearing in the tribunal, which was positive. Again, that was quite groundbreaking, the first to say that diplomatic immunity did not hold in trafficking cases. But obviously that was then appealed to the Employment Appeal Tribunal. We didn't win there, and then we appealed. We were allowed to leapfrog the Court of Appeal, and then we were leapfrogged straight to the Supreme Court. And I think, again, that was because we'd already seen the cases that ATLU had done previously on the former diplomat. So, yeah, it was a really long process, and all credit to the client.
Yeah.
All credit to the client, because someone in her position, first of all, being so brave to bring the case, but second of all, to really that test of time to keep going all that time has been really incredible. And, she was really petrified throughout, really was. And what I would say is Philippa Webb, who was the barrister from the outset on this case, her mum is actually Filipino. And I think there's something to be said about representation in the legal field, and having, there was certain times where Philippa would say, look, let me talk to her, because, my mum's from the Philippines, she gets it. She gets the history. She understood it, and it really resonated with the client, being able to tell her that look, you've got someone who's really on your side and really knows where you're coming from, and that's why I would say that diversity in the legal field is so important in every field, but even more so in this field where we are really, our clients are so vulnerable, and their lived experiences are so different from the lived experiences of the judiciary who are making these decisions. Just to have your own advocates who really represent you, truly represent you, is something really unique, something really special. I really saw that play out in that case. And so, we were able to quash diplomatic immunity in trafficking, which is, like you say, it was incredible. I mean, it was very emotional as well, I'd say, for all of us, for all the legal team who took it forward.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, I love how as well, just you can really sense, you know, how challenging this would have been for your client and how brave she is. But to have that support, that legal team around her, as you say, it is so important. And that's what maybe helps people to keep going. And I mean, what a step to take. I mean, she's, you know, working under a diplomat and experienced horrific incidents all throughout that time. So very, very brave and groundbreaking and a really interesting decision. So anyone listening, please have a look at it. I actually read it through one of the, I think it was the Industrial Law Journal, covers the case quite well. So would highly recommend that. Now, another area that you dealt with, and perhaps you still do, is in terms of asylum seeking victims of trafficking. I mean, I'd like to hear in general what issues do arise with that. It's been many years since I've worked in those cases, but something that you worked on is really quite striking in terms of a decision that was issued by the Home Office back when I think it was Theresa May was in charge. So I wonder, can you share a little bit about that work and that case?
Yeah, so I think that was really my first experiences of working on strategic litigation. I didn't really realise I was doing strategic litigation on the case. It was kind of just helping that client, and she just happened to be the first one to challenge this. But it was a really different way because it was such a widespread issue that she was facing. It turned into this bigger strategic case. So it was back in 2018. They made the government, Theresa May's government, made cuts to the amount of support, weekly financial support, that was going to be given to victims of trafficking who were also asylum seeking trafficking victims. Mm-hmm. So if that makes sense, they've both been trafficked, but they are also seeking asylum here in the UK. So you might, for example, get European trafficking victims who are here but not seeking asylum, that would be getting almost double. It was a 40% cut. So, they'd be getting significantly more in relation to their weekly allowance. And, the government's rulings were, decisions were based on the fact that, if they can survive on this amount, then, if asylum seekers can survive on this amount, then why should these trafficking victims get more? Yeah. So our argument was obviously because they're trafficking victims, because by their very nature, they are still vulnerable, and having a history of trafficking will always put you in a position where you are vulnerable to re-trafficking. And we really saw that playing out in terms of if you don't have enough money to buy your essentials, which include traveling to activities or therapeutic activities, which my client needed to go to each week to help her on her recovery, then those cycles of being re-trafficked and being vulnerable are not going to be broken, and you are going to be back in that vulnerability to make you then susceptible for re-trafficking. And that was the whole point, that the government has a duty to ensure that people are in a position where they aren't vulnerable to trafficking, that they aren't going to be exploited. And they were breaching that by kind of having this blanket cut, which thankfully, with a lot of kind of support from the whole sector, so loads of NGOs who are supporting victims of trafficking could really give witness statements about how that money was, really impacting on the daily lives of our clients if they weren't getting that money weekly. And it was quite incredible because not only did we get the cut kind of found to be unlawful and reinstated to the amount that it was before, it was also backdated. So they got this big lump sum, which was about £1,000 in the end to each of those victims who hadn't been paid in the meantime. So it was really lovely, actually. So there's about 1,000 individuals who were affected by that fell into that bracket, and they each got £1,000, which is incredible when you think about the monetary value of that judgment for those clients. And it was, what was really amazing actually was years later, this was a couple of years ago, we were contacted by a victim of trafficking who was wanting to study law and was wanting to come and do voluntary work at our organisation, and obviously wanting to help a victim of trafficking. I was like, yeah, come and work with us. And he turned up on the first day and he thanked me for that judgment.
Wow. Amazing.
it was, honestly, I'm tearing up a little bit now because it made me tear up, because I'd obviously impacted my client, but I'd always thought about all those victims out there who had been impacted by this, and just imagined what it would have felt like. And he took me through what it meant to him at the time and what that money did for him. And honestly, like, he turned up that day to work, and I think he had some shoes that he'd used black marker to make look black and smarter. Like, this is the level of, you know, it was beautiful. It was just such a beautiful moment, honestly. And it was very special to kind of, again, another full circle moment.
Another full circle moment, yes.
What you've given out there coming back to you, and just, it was very special.
And particularly, that's such a vulnerable group. I mean, I don't think people realise, you know, the pressure within that group. So that's just a lovely story and a lovely example, and great case, a fantastic case, and delighted that was successful, and extremely, extremely important.
Yeah.
Just looking at some of your other work. So I know that over the years, you and your team, you know, have been at the forefront of challenging the UK authorities in relation to forced labour in their own supply chains. So that's, again, really, really interesting and really relevant at the moment. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's involved in this type of work, and what type of legal action do you take?
I think it's kind of the next stage of where I had been more focused on individuals and how, government policies are affecting my clients, working more kind of internationally and thinking about trafficking on more of a global scale, and how really kind of moving into more of the business and human rights angle, and how so many of our products made today are made through exploitation, and how there's so little being done in the UK on a kind of more governmental policy basis. And it's bringing together kind of my public law background of obviously challenging the government, but also looking at more of these global issues in terms of, you know, how are we tackling trafficking and exploitation in the supply chains that are coming to the UK for products being made around the world. And really the UK, I mean, we mentioned Theresa May, you know, she brought in this Modern Slavery Act and called it, you know, this groundbreaking at the world forefront. And really, it was a huge bugbear for me, because it didn't really improve support for victims of trafficking. It brought in a lot of criminalisation for traffickers, which is great, and was supposed to be a deterrent, really, by bringing in and creating, you know, more stringent criminal repercussions for traffickers in the justice system. But what it really failed to do was create a better system to support victims through a criminal prosecution. And I actually went and I did a research piece on why we need to support victims to be able to be stable enough to give evidence to bring traffickers to justice. But B, what she really was kind of, what was the flagship of that act was how businesses were going to be expected to report on how they were tackling modern slavery in their supply chains. Now, the thing is, it's such a weak piece of legislation, because it basically asks businesses to create a statement of how they are tackling modern slavery in their supply chain. But that statement could literally say, I'm not doing anything to tackle modern slavery in my supply chain. And really and truly, they fulfilled the criteria, because they told us what they're doing. There's no objective analysis of what it's a tick box, exactly. So there's no objective analysis of the action that they're taking and whether it's effective or not. And it's also voluntary. So what a lot of the research has shown is that many companies who are supposed to report are not even reporting, and there's no real sanctions for not. And I appreciate there's a carrot and stick approach, but it's so weak. And when you compare it to kind of some of the legislation that's coming out of the US and now even in the EU, just last year they've agreed to new due diligence laws, which are really, really, really widespread and really quite robust. they will take years to get into place and to get working. But even the fact that they have been agreed and it's a work in progress is, groundbreaking. And of course, we're not part of the EU anymore, so we don't fall under that. We're still using this piece of legislation, the Modern Slavery Act, which is really, really weak. So yeah, lots of my work has really been about highlighting how the government policies say one thing, which is that they're really committed to ending modern slavery. And on the other side, their policies and their procedures are not following through. So there's been a lot of announcements about how the government is really going to tackle modern slavery in the supply chain. But when you actually look at the contracts that they're undertaking, it's the due diligence isn't there. So, for example, this case that we brought in relation to NHS rubber gloves that were being bought during COVID, even pre-COVID, to be fair, the contracts that were being undertaken, the US have a system where any products being brought in through the US customs will be analysing those, and a complaint can be made in relation to them if they have modern slavery in the supply chain. And what had happened is gloves from this particular company, Supermax, who were based in Malaysia, had been on the radar in the US and had been banned from being imported into the US because the investigation had found that there was 10 out of 11 indicators of forced labour, according to the ILO indicators of forced labour. So it's pretty damning, 10 out of 11. Yeah. And that had happened kind of a month before the government had agreed new contracts with Supermax UK Limited, a subsidiary of Supermax Corporation in Malaysia, without what appeared any kind of clear due diligence and awareness in relation to what had happened in the US and the need to really verify their own due diligence based on if their tick box exercises are coming back with everything's fine and the US is saying we've investigated and there's 10 out of 11, there's a little bit of a disconnect there. Do you see what I mean? And what we found in the disclosure that we had was the government had sent one email, I think it was one email and one meeting, one follow-up email with Supermax about the issues. But then they had agreed the new contracts without having the information come back from those questions that they'd raised until after. And so the due diligence is supposed to happen before you agree to have the contracts with the organisations, not afterwards of, okay, we'll let you through the door and then we'll do our checks, which was basically what's going on. So it was really highlighting the weaknesses in how actually the government are following through with what they say on paper. And we managed to get them to settle that case and agree to improve how they carried out their due diligence in relation to NHS supply chains and gloves in particular. So it was really great in terms of also just being in contact with our clients, who were still, some of them still in the factories in Malaysia, and seeing how those actions that were being taken both in the US and the UK was then physically leading to changes in the factories and how they were actually being treated to improve conditions in their daily working lives,
Yeah. So that was part of my next question, was how, these legal actions that you take at a very high level actually trickle down and impact communities on the ground who are affected by these abuses. So that's fantastic that you're able to, reach back out to those that were working in the factory and see how, their lives and conditions improve. And that's global.
Exactly, it's global. And I think that's what is really lacking from, the reason we were able to bring that was because we had the evidence from this US complaint, this US investigation, because the US procedures are so much more kind of robust than what we have in the UK. And I think when we're thinking about our individual clients, there's really not that opportunity here in the UK to hold corporations and organisations to account for abuses within the supply chains. And I think that's what really needs to change. Even the EU new legislation it's going to, in theory, I know the practice will be hard, but at least it's got it in the legislation there, that clients will be able to bring these cases against corporations. So if there's any individual within an organisation, in a business's supply chain that's been exploited, that head, that corporate will be able to be taken to court, and the burden of evidence will be shifted. So at the moment, it's so difficult in the UK because, first of all, you have to establish a duty of care within a supply chain. So if you've got, like, I don't know, a big corporation like Supermax, and you've got Supermax UK, if you had an individual anywhere within the supply chain, you'd have to prove that they are connected to Supermax Corporation, which isn't always clear. You've got lots of convoluted suppliers within a supply chain. For example, we were working on a case against Boohoo for individuals who had been exploited in factories here in Leicester. It was, something that was covered hugely in the media. But then actually to bring a case for those clients, we had to prove that they were a Boohoo worker, even though they had worked in some random factory in Leicester, and the supply chains are very convoluted to show it was kind of different suppliers each week, Mm-hmm. So that burden of proof is on an individual client. And what's really unique about the EU legislation is actually it shifts that. And it says the corporations should be responsible for providing that evidence. And that's really groundbreaking. And also in the UK, we because they're not employed directly, for example, by Boohoo, they'd be employed by the supplier. So we'd also have to establish a duty of care between that large corporation and that individual. Again, the EU doesn't have that. Anywhere in that supply chain, you could bring that action. And then that's what really needs to happen, because I've talked about how vulnerable these victims of trafficking, these victims of exploitation are. To have to go first, find all that evidence from, why would you have supply chain evidence as a worker? Second, to then go to court to establish a duty of care before you can even think about actually bringing a case. And I spoke about this in there was an article in the FT last year, at the end of last year, because it followed through the case that we were bringing against Boohoo and how difficult it was for those clients, and how really the government's lack of legislation and a framework for these cases is creating a place where Britain is now becoming a dumping ground, because we're letting all of these products in, like I showed with the glove case, but also where we've got exploitation happening here, it's so difficult to bring it to justice because there's just not that legal framework. So on two folds, I feel like we've really been kind of, using litigation to highlight these lacunas in our laws.
Yeah, and I mean that area of business and human rights, it's really expanding, and we have had guests on recently, even those who are lawyers working within global NGOs, that are seeing this come up time and time again and using various strategies to combat it. But I think it's definitely one to watch. And I'm keen to see how you and your team develop that area of your work. It's really important. And staying on the global theme and the international theme, I know in general this is something that you're very interested in and very focused on at the moment. But you have been involved through volunteer work as well. I'll mention your role at Al-Haq and working with lawyers for Palestinian human rights. Before we go back to that question, I might also mention that you worked in the Human Rights and Legal Aid Department of one of the world's largest NGOs, which is based in Bangladesh. So can you tell us a little bit more about that experience and how it came about?
Yeah, again, this was actually when I kind of left the corporate world and was looking at how I could gain more experience in the human rights field. And my family are from Bangladesh, so I speak Bengali. So that was an advantage when I was kind of looking at the world and looking where I could go. And again, I think it was really kind of that calling to kind of go back to my roots on this and why I was passionate about helping vulnerable people, because, what I love about the UK is that we've got public law. It's such an incredible tool to be able to hold government systems and government decisions to account. And that's where I really, I look at Bangladesh and I'm like, there's so many issues and we don't have those same kind of frameworks where you can do that. And going back there to kind of, even just to upskill and we would in the villages kind of providing kind of tools, but also training to people in relation to what are their rights, particularly women. And you've got lots of different religions in Bangladesh. So you'll have different systems and different courts in the villages that are based on those faiths. So actually upskilling and training individuals on what are their rights, what can they do, and even giving them that knowledge, which a lot of them, again, it's very male dominated, will be telling them things based on the patriarchy and based on what, their husbands want them to know and not what actually the laws should be saying. Now, again, the decision makers are males. So you see that playing out as well in terms of the decisions that are being made. And that's where we would have advocates who would go and actually be the advocates and actually say, well, no, that's not right. And this is which the laws are. But I think it was really, I don't know, for me, such a privilege to go and see that and be able to actually, had I not have had the life I have here in the UK, that could have been me, that could have been me in those villages if my dad hadn't got an amazing opportunity to come here and to work here and to train here and to, build a life here, then, that could have been me in Bangladesh, and being able to identify on that level with individuals who were so grateful to have been educated in these laws, and me, on the other hand, who just on a whim was like, you know what, I'm going to throw in my job and I'm going to go back to law school and I'm going to train to be a lawyer. Just the privilege that I have. It was very humbling to kind of really see that with my own eyes.
Wow, an amazing experience. And just we touched there a little bit on your work with Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights and Al-Haq. Now, Al-Haq, we have had guests on before. You have also volunteered at that organisation, but just, in general, we've had so many guests on. We've spoken about the question of Palestine many times. And as lawyers, we're in a small group of lawyers as well who kind of came together because we were kind of pretty much shocked at the silence around what was happening, particularly from my experience, human rights lawyers who've remained largely silent on this issue. And, you can delve into it and you can come up with different reasons and different excuses, but I'm still mind blown by the fact that people are still not able to or not willing to, come out and speak out against what's happening. But just to revisit one of the questions I asked last year, what can the legal community do you think, or, from your experience and what we witnessed over the last 18 months plus, is enough being done by us lawyers internationally and collectively?
Yeah, I think it's really tricky on one hand. I think a lot of lawyers have also lost faith in the law because we've seen, these arrest warrants being issued, these kind of historic arrest warrants, and then just being ignored. So actually, if we've got these huge global mechanisms that are being, that were developed and were supposed to protect in such situations, and they're just being ignored, then it does make you question, as a human rights lawyer, actually, what are we all doing here? And I think it also comes back to, we've also got to be careful in relation to, do we as Western lawyers, are we going to have all the answers? Are we going to be, on our big shiny white horses going in and fixing the Palestinian problem? Probably not. But what we can certainly do is, like you say, is use our advocacy skills. And especially where our own government are taking actions which are unlawful, which is why the Glan case, for example, is phenomenal. The case in relation to whether the arms that are being sold and provided to Israel are lawful. I think that's where us UK-based human rights lawyers should really be looking. And I think there's lots to be said about whether or not whether it's through trade, whether it's through kind of providing, funding and arms like the Glam Place is looking at. I think there's a lot to be looked at. And without kind of losing faith in the legal mechanisms because of what we've seen happening, I think there's still things that we can do and be looking to do in relation to challenging our own government and our own government policies in relation to how they are acting with their relationships with Israel.
Sure. And I'm thinking even your work around supply chains as well, would be something that's worth looking into with all governments really at this stage.
Yeah, because how I got into this actually was because at Hickman and Rose, it was Daniel Mackover, who was a partner there, he was the founder of Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights. Yes. And when I joined Hickman and Rose, he was actually working on an arrest warrant for Tiffany Livni, who had previously been the head of the defence in Israel. And he had previously got an arrest warrant in the UK when she was supposed to be coming here. And which is incredible in itself, to have been able to gather all the evidence, to provide it to a judge here, to get an arrest warrant commissioned for her, so that when her plane came and landed, she didn't get off the plane, she had to go back to Israel, and really how it really played out in terms of how those diplomatic relationships between the UK and Israel were are they lawful? And what was interesting is then it was 2011, 2010 actually, I think we were working on it, when she was due to come again. And so I was helping him also again to get another arrest warrant. And the UK government then changed the law. So you could no longer get an arrest warrant straight from a judge. If an arrest warrant was to be issued, it would have to go via the DPP. So again, they then created a protection which would ensure that the situation didn't happen again. So we weren't able to get an arrest warrant. But his work in this field has been incredible. And then he set up Palestinian human rights. And that's when I went out to the West Bank with Al-Haq. I was working there, and it was really, we were gathering evidence in the field to actually, like you said, with business and human rights, of organisations that were actually, their actions were physically taking pictures of the actions that they were taking in the fields in West Bank, and gathering evidence that was later, when I came back to the UK, that actually played part of a complaint that Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights made to the OECD about corporations and about how they were acting in the West Bank. So it was another kind of full circle, in terms of, not only with Daniel at Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights, but then with Al-Haq, and then coming back to Palestinian Human Rights and being involved. It was amazing to see kind of the work that I had done out in the field that actually been used in a legal mechanism like that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, it must have been an experience working with Daniel. We were so lucky to have him on the podcast to share his experience, and he's just truly fascinating. That's so interesting, and I like to see those links happen there, and to see that experience being brought back to impact the situation here. Just as well, I suppose, with your work, and we've delved into a little bit of it, I'm sure there's much more that we could go into, but how do you think, the title of our podcast, Activist Lawyer, activism and the law work together to bring about, meaningful societal change? And how have you seen this dynamic kind of play out in your own career from what you've witnessed?
I think it's really about the bottoms up approach. That's what I think activist lawyers should be about. And that's really what I felt, especially, I mentioned the Boohoo case that I was working on. It was a really different way of working for me, because we were so on the ground in Leicester, in kind of some of the organisations on the ground there that were helping people who had been affected by the exploitation in the garments industry there, which was so widespread. And for me, working with NGOs on the ground was a real privilege, because obviously I'm based in the UK. So apart from this volunteer work that I've done kind of prior to Wilsons in different countries, I've not been on the ground here in the UK as much, to build cases from the ground. And I think that's what an activist really does, because I think they need to be led by the communities that they're advocating for. And it comes back to what I was saying about the one case where we had Philippa Webb, who had that, lived experience for our client. I think there is something to be said about connecting with the real experiences of our clients, to be led by them and not be led by, and it's easy to say this because I know as a lawyer we have to be like, okay, but the barrister needs this and the courts want this and the government are going to expect this from you. But actually being like, no, why are we here? What's happening on the ground, and being led by that and what the client needs, and trying to then fit that into the framework we have. I think that's really important to have that bottoms up approach, as opposed to coming from it, which I think I've definitely seen both approaches to cases from barristers particularly. And the difference is incredible when you can be client led rather than law led. And that doesn't come naturally to lawyers, because our job is to think of the law and to think about, presenting it in the courts. But I think it's really important, especially when you're an activist, is actually they might not always match. Yeah. And it's difficult. It is really difficult, but it's really important to be led by your client and best interests of your clients.
To be client led, yes, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, for anyone who's listening, who might be listening today and feel inspired by your work and by your experience, and are considering a career in law similar to yours, what advice would you give them? We touched on it a little bit at the start. What perhaps are some of the challenges that they should prepare for?
Yeah, definitely. We touched a bit about it initially, but I think, like I said, the work is legal aid work. So that comes with its challenges in itself, just in terms of funding for your cases, but funding for yourself as well. It can sound really glamorous, like I was saying, all of the international cases, but, being in the news, but really and truly that, it's not well paid work. You could easily be a lawyer in a corporate organisation and earn 2, 3, 4, who knows? I don't even know, because I wouldn't want to think about how much corporate lawyers get paid. But because of that, you've got to really know you want to do this work. And I think the best way to do that is to have that hands-on experience of what I was talking about in terms of volunteering, getting in there with these NGOs who are on the ground, so you can really show that you've got that hands-on experience, not only because then you understand the clients when you come to do the work, but you can demonstrate that when you come to these interviews that are so competitive, because it is so underfunded and there's not many organisations that are able to do legal aid work and keep afloat even at the moment. So the jobs are, there's not loads of roles, not loads of organisations, and the roles are very competitive. So that work will put you in good stead for those interviews, but it will also help you understand exactly why you want to do this work. And it's something that you really need that to keep coming back to that when you are, I think in this area of law, you really do chip away at these big structural inequalities, and there will be days where you will feel like you're not getting anywhere. You'll feel like you're up against the legal aid agency because they make so many hoops to get funding on your case. You will feel like the government lawyers are never going to budge on, your client's case, even though it's so clear that they should. You will be up against barristers who, are really far removed from your clients and what they want to do, and you need to advocate for your clients. And, you'll be up against the court and the judiciary, who again have no lived experience of anything we're talking about, and you have to be the one to bridge that gap between that client and how it's presented to the court. And it's a lot. And you have your clients.
It is.
Then you have your clients who you're trying to manage, and they've lost faith in this system, and so they should, because it's a really, you are up against all of that. So sometimes you have to be the bearer of bad news, and that kind of makes you the front of that bad news to your client. And then how are they supposed to trust you as well? It's really difficult, and you have to celebrate the wins. So even though you have to stay humble in this and remember that you haven't, these cases, I haven't done that. It's my clients that have done that, but I do have to celebrate that. I do have to celebrate those wins, because they are the little lights that keep you going when you have days and days of feeling like not only you're not making progress, but sometimes you feel like you're going backwards, because you'll have a great case and then the government will be like, okay, so you've stopped that policy happening. How do we create it in a different way? And they'll just bring out a more outrageous policy that will, will cut it again. And I think that happened with the support for victims case. As soon as we got those cuts overturned, there was rumours that it was going to happen again, but just happened slightly differently to make it, to make it not unlawful. And that's what you have to be prepared for all the time, that you're kind of taking one step forward and two steps back all the time. But you do have to find a way to keep going. And that's why you do really need to understand, what is your motivation here on those days where you aren't getting anywhere, where you aren't getting paid very much, and it feels like a long time since you've had one of those light moments of success, So yeah, be prepared for that journey. It is worth it if you know why it's worth it for you, I think, and that's what you need to be clear on.
Brilliant. That was just such an honest answer to that question, and I think it's realistic.
Yeah, sorry, probably too honest.
No. I'm feeling this. I'm feeling your energy there, and putting myself back in those days where I was working with legal aid, and it is. I mean, look, it's challenging. There's no doubt about that. But as you said, it can be rewarding, and to celebrate those wins. And of course, you're meeting with wonderful, wonderful, brave people as well, which really is also part of that job too. Well, look, Nusrat, you've been so generous with your time. I've been really looking forward to talking to you and to learning more about your work, which is truly fascinating, and I hope to keep in touch. And yes, thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much for having me. It was lovely.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.